join. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second critical conversation. But before I go any further, can I please get a quick confirmation if whether I am audible? Okay, thank you. Welcome again. I am Tato Mpahlele, an LLD researcher at the South African Research Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability. Today, our second critical conversation, the theme is on reimagining a just urban future, democracy, inclusivity, and politics. But before we go any further, can I please hand it over to Prof Oliver Fuhr to tell you more about CLES, what we do, and also more about the critical conversation series. Prof, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mpahlele. Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for joining late. I had technical difficulties here. I am joining from my apartment in Berlin. I could not join from the office because I'm sharing it with another colleague from Italy, and I did not want to make a lot of noise and disturb her. But I'm glad that we are all here, and I want to wish a very special welcome to our guest speakers, Prof Fiona Anciano and Ms. Peta Wolpe. Thanks very much for honoring our invitation and for availing yourself to present at our second critical conversation series for this year, despite your very busy schedules. And let me also thank Ms. Mpahlele and her team who've made this a reality. Thanks very much, Tato, for all the work that you've done behind the scene to make this happen. As Ms. Mpahlele will introduce the guest speakers later, I'm very happy to indicate that we are pleased that they joined us. They are very established researchers and activists in the fields of urban governance, urban energy and climate change law, and they are recognized internationally as well as nationally. So we are grateful that you are here. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or who have not heard about CLES before, it is a specialized research subunit, which is within the research unit of the Faculty of Law of the Northwest University. And the chair is located in the Potchefstroom campus of the university. And it forms part of the NRF SACHI initiative program. And it was established in 2019, approved in 2018, and then started running in 2019. And then at the end of 2023, it was upgraded as a Tier 1 chair. And it was initially led by Prof du Plessis, who is now in Stellenbosch, and effective from January last year, the NRF confirmed my appointment as a chair. We work in the intersecting areas of law, urban development, and environmental sustainability. And our primary focus is to generate scholarly outputs in this area and to also contribute towards the building of research skills that are needed to support urban development in the South African context and beyond. And to this end, we have postgraduate students drawn from several African countries. The majority of them come from South Africa, and we also have a few postdocs that are doing research in the areas that I alluded to earlier. And once CLES was established, Prof thought it necessary to establish the critical conversation series as an opportunity for us to bring together academics and practitioners to be able to engage on topics that are of relevance that we deem it necessary to engage on or to engage with. And we usually invite academics, students, practitioners to join us, even those in government, so that we can be able to listen to a presentation from an expert, a practitioner, or a scholar, or two of them, or three, and then be able to have fruitful engagements with them after their presentations. So we had the first critical conversation in 2019, and that used to take place in the Potch campus. But following COVID, we decided to move things virtually. And we had contemplated the possibility of reverting to the previous status But we realize that it's also challenging because we can reach a broader audience if we do things visually. So at the moment, we are keeping things through our visual platforms. Without much ado, let me thank Ms. Mpatlele again and ask her to introduce our guest speakers. And I hope that you enjoyed their presentations on a very topical issue, the issue of justice in the urban context, which about 3 of our students are writing on. They're writing their dissertations on. So that already indicates that a lot of people are interested in that shared team. I'll allow them to present, and then we can be able to engage in questions and answers after their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. Before any further, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Ms. Peta Wolpe, who has worked in the climate and energy space for the past 18 years. She is currently the director of Tournesol and works as an urban energy and climate change practitioner. Prior to this, she was the managing director of Sustainable Energy Africa. She has a wide range of experience in the urban energy and climate sector in South Africa, as well as other countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. Her current focus is on just transition, energy poverty, and also gender. She has worked across the board from poor communities to high-level stakeholders and politicians. Before returning to South Africa in 1996, Ms. Wolpe has worked in London as a senior psychiatric social worker for 13 years. Ms. Wolpe has written a number of policy briefs, articles, and chapter contribution in books. She also has a degree in sociology from the University of Essex and also a Master of Science in Social Administration and Social Work Studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science. We also have Prof Fiona Anciano, who is a professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of the Western Cape, and also a visiting scholar at the University West Sweden. She leads the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group at the University of Western Cape and also holds an NRF South African Research Chair in Democracy and Urban Governance. She is a qualitative researcher that specializes in participatory action research, and her work focuses on democratic innovations, informal urban governance, and just urban transitions. Fiona co-chairs a cluster in the Global Participator Network. She also has numerous publications which include co-authored book Democracy Disconnected, Participation and Governance in a City of the South. Her research combines critical scholarship with engaged and collaborative approaches to strengthening democratic practice and inclusive urban governance. So how today's event is going to go is that we're going to first have a presentation from Prof Fiona, who will be followed by Ms. Wolpe. And then after that, we're going to have a Q&A session where we, as the audience, will be able to participate. And then after the session, we will have final inputs from our speakers to tell us more about the experience, the event, and anything that they might have missed. And then we will also wrap up the thing, and then that part will be facilitated by Ms. Segwagwa. So for now, I would like to introduce Prof Fiona Anciano. Prof, over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having me today this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you from, must be very clear, it's wonderful to be in an audience with people who are obviously many studying law and understand law, not my background at all, nor am I a specialist in energy policy or energy frameworks. But I have been working for many years now thinking about urban infrastructure, thinking about how cities work, and particularly how cities work in low-income areas and informal settlements. And more recently, how we think about that in relation to what a just urban transition is. So, okay. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon thinking through how do we think about a just urban transition, but I'll be quite brief on that because I think the following speakers got more input on that topic. And then I really want us to spend some time thinking around how do we govern a just urban transition? How do we think about the idea of a just urban transition in relationship to governance, but also in relation to democracy? Because we live in South Africa in a democratic liberal infrastructure. And so these different elements of how we think about our cities and how we think about justice and just urban transition should be thought about in the context of the regime that we live under. So just to refresh, for many of you, I'm sure you already have heard this word and this concept, but I wanted to situate a little bit of our thinking around what is a just urban transition. And this is from work we've done at the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group. Now, it is a contested term. And also, I think we've heard a lot about just transitions. So I've thrown the urban in there. I think a couple of other people also talk about a just urban transition, but I wanted to specifically look at it from that perspective. Now, it is contested, and there isn't one way of thinking about a just transition, but we are focusing on thinking about it around how you govern cities in ways that are both environmentally sustainable and socially and economically just. And this is really quite pressing, given the rapid urbanization demands in South Africa, but also globally, everywhere really. And so there has to be investment in infrastructure while trying to balance social and economic needs of populations, as at the same time dealing with global sustainability agendas and a global approach to a just transition, normally focused from an energy perspective. So in South Africa, that's also happened. The just transition has really had an energy focus. And our research has tried to broaden that quite explicitly to say an energy focus is very important, but actually a just urban transition should also be framed around livelihood opportunities that include other infrastructures, particularly water, sanitation, housing, even transport, etc. Because all of these kinds of infrastructures that we live with on a daily basis are interrelated with each other. So a just urban transition requires a focus on how change happens, not just what should happen. So a lot of literature and research and thinking has been, what would a just transition look like? But actually how that take place is really, really crucial. And I think there is, very good work being done on this, particularly around a just energy transition. But what are the processes and people that govern this change? And so it's not quick, it's not easy, and we know that there are multiple dimensions to a just transition and a just urban transition. But it's really important to think through particularly how we govern these in order to think about sustainabilities in cities as places where people can thrive, but without damaging natural resources. Now, I think one of the key things when we think about a just transition is to really go back and sort of just remind ourselves about what is justice? What is social justice? When we say just, what do we actually mean? Because it makes the reality of how we think about governance, cities, sustainability more tangible. This is a four process model of thinking about what is social justice. It comes from a long stream of authors, and starting, I suppose, with Rawls. But the idea of distributive justice, equitable outcomes are reached, procedural justice, decision-making and conflict resolution processes are fair. In politics, we'd often think about participatory justice, like are people participating? Are the procedures fair for how they participate? Then the justice of recognition, everyone treated fairly without discrimination, regardless of their identity or values. So we might use language in politics around equality. And then restorative justice, are past injustices addressed? So that, I'm sure, is not new to anybody from a legal background, but just to keep these ideas of social justice in the forefront of our minds. So now to turn to thinking about, okay, so if that's some thinking around how we can conceptualize a just urban transition, how do you govern a just urban transition? The question we ask ourselves is, how can the state and citizens work together to support a just urban transition realizing that there's a need to co-create long-term solutions to support sustainable transition. And today I'm going to specifically talk to you about research we've been doing in a project that we run called Governing the Just Urban Transition that focuses on coping strategies of small businesses in low-income areas in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and specifically how these small businesses have tried to secure water and energy in the areas in which they work, and how we can think about what they tell us about what sustainability looks like for them and about what justice looks like for them and what the access challenges may be. This is a multi team piece of work, so we're doing it in combination with other partners from the UK and with partners from Johannesburg as well. And that's our team of researchers, PhDs, and masters as well. That image. We are still in the middle of the project. We haven't finished our data collection, so by no means am I going to tell you what our great grand findings are yet, but I thought I'd share with you a little bit about the methodology and where we've worked and some of the things that are coming out. So we've been looking at an area called Schwetler in Alexandra in Johannesburg, and an area called BM section, and another part of Khayelitsha called Makaza in Cape Town. And in these two areas, we've specifically gone to talk to small enterprises, small businesses, 5 kinds: creches or ECD centers, informal eateries, shisniyamas, taverns, shebeens, car washes, and hair salons. And we've worked with these small enterprise owners through multiple methods, including focus groups, interviews, etc. But one of our key methods has been to actually use photo voice. Now, and there's an image of doing photo voice with participants. Photo voice is a participatory action research method where you go and you ask people we give them a camera just like that, a disposable camera, and we give them a prompt. In this case, it would be around how do you, in your small business, how do you access energy and water? What is your relationship with energy and water? What does that mean? And that's about as much of a prompt as we give. It's a very open-ended process. And then we say, you've got 3 days to take 29 pictures until your disposable camera is finished. I don't know if not everybody here may know what a disposable plastic camera is. They're pretty old. You don't get them around easily now. And you could do the same thing with a smartphone, but we use disposable cameras because they're not as prone to theft. They don't have any value in and of themselves, but also they are not something where you can delete an image if you don't like it. You're not self-editing. You can't see that picture until it's been developed. And so we find that we get a much more authentic set of engagements from our participants around what and where and how they live without self-editing or criticizing or thinking about, oh, maybe I'll take it in a different angle, or maybe I'll do a better picture. It's not a performative act taking the photos. It's a genuine reflection of something they see through that lens at the time in which they take the picture. And so from that, we had about 15 participants in Johannesburg and 15 participants in Cape Town. And once each of these groups have now taken their photographs, we then have an exhibition. And we did that with all of the images in Johannesburg, and then we did one in Khayelitsha in March. And at the exhibitions, it's important to have the participants there, residents, civil society, academics, but we also invite city officials. In this case, we had the mayor and other city officials there. And they see the exhibition. It's not curated. We do not describe anything. There's no analysis. It is just participants sharing the images and explaining why they took them, as well as having all, 40 or 50. We normally have about 50 of large prints in the room. And just to note, we found this a very effective way of generating engagement with key stakeholders. We did similar photo voice methods in 2023 and 2024 around sanitation and sustainable sanitation use, container-based sanitation in informal settlements. And actually at this photo voice exhibition, the Mayor of Cape Town said that exhibition from 2023 had led directly to policy changes around how they think through sanitation in informal settlements. So it's quite a powerful method. Now, I'm going to share with you a handful of images and the quotes. These captions come directly from participants. We don't edit them. They are their words. And these are really, I decided today to focus on water not energy, because yeah, I think it's good to have a different take for a little, think beyond only the energy paradigm about what a just urban transition can look like. And so I've chosen just a small selection of images and just from the Cape Town context. So this is from an ECD center. The caption says, "This photo shows the way we use and save water, because where we fetch water is far. The water that the child is using to wash her hands, we use it to flush the porta potter. This makes things easier for us." So a porta potter, by the way, is a small container-based toilet that is designed for an individual home or an individual room and has a cartridge that can be removed. So they have porta potters, portable flush toilets, or in many ECD centers in Khayelitsha. Here's another image. For hygiene, children use this container to wash their hands before eating or when coming from the toilet. So both of these images show us, and the captions tell us, that actually water is a scarce resource and that it isn't easy to access water for ECD centers, but there's a very high need for water for multiple different kinds of tasks, whether it's washing hands, going to the toilet, washing dishes, and for drinking. And so they have to find ways of reusing the water, and that accessing the water requires actually taking quite long trips. There isn't plumbed water where they are, and you've got to have a strategy every single day to think about where and how and when are you going to get access to that water. And then you also have to ensure that children are trained or exposed or explained to how they must and can and should use that water, so not to have it wasted, but also not to contaminate different sources. So just from these two photographs, we can see the precarity and the challenges of accessing water. And yet, what this also shows us is that it is a very sustainable use of water. So there is both a challenge, but also a sustainability element there. Now we move on to Shisanyama. This is an eatery in one part of Makaza in Khayelitsha. And this image, the eatery owner is explaining that this is a customer washing their hands before eating the meat. It is a little bottle with water and liquid soap. The water comes from the tap. So in this particular area, it's a shared informal settlement trading space. There is a tap with water there, but that one single standpipe is shared between multiple different eateries and all customers. And so in this case, they have to keep water in a container with soap to have it easily available for customers. But there is, again, traditions about hand washing and how that's done, but then also making sure there's equitable sharing of that standpipe. And also in this case, sometimes the water may be disconnected, it may have run out. So having the bottled water on hand is also very useful. So you don't end up with this context where you just don't have any access to water. Here we have also from the Shisanyama, one of the ladies washing the dishcloths. And just in this image, you can see again that actually water is reused and reused, and it's saved in buckets. It doesn't just flow from the tap in an unconscious way. It's actually constantly being seen, how can you make sustainable long-term use of the water? And here is an image from a car wash. And this is quite interesting because obviously car washes are very water-intensive businesses. But this is what the participant explains. We are not allowed to use the pipe. We must use the drums to wash the cars. You must make sure your pipe is not linked to the tap. After you finish filling in the drums, you must switch them off, because if you use the pipe, it will waste too much water. So anyone who was in Cape Town around, if anyone knows about day zero, I'm sure many of you do. In Cape Town, we had that drought, and we had also absolutely no access to water. Now the threat of a day zero. And there we were a city that was really educated around the fact that you can't just turn a hose pipe on and let it flow, and that you have to reuse and reuse and reuse your water. So the same principle works for car washes. And while it's not always adhered to, certainly with the participants we spoke to, they do adhere to it for various reasons. They will be fined, and there are different monitors who walk around from the city occasionally, and if they get caught using a hose pipe, they will be fined and their business threatened. So they just don't do it. The risk is too high. But also they can now reuse and rewash as they go with that water as well. So if they are paying, and many of them, the payment's a complicated story. Sometimes they're using standpipes linked to their neighbors. Mostly they're using standpipes that just come straight from municipal supply. So they're not having to pay for the water per se, but ensuring that it's in their buckets and always available also means that the scarcity, in case you run out, isn't going to stop you from running your business if you've got it stored up in the buckets. Okay, so that is a snapshot of just one insight into one small area about how people try to use access and have water security. And, there are bigger questions here, and I'm not going to go into that detail right now about what does this access of water mean and tell us about what a just urban transition is in terms of how people are thinking through scarcity, access, sustainability, water precarity, because I want to take us down a slightly different route. I think that those are all very important questions, but not for today for me, because today I want us to think about the political angle of a just transition and the political angle of governance. And so when I look at a just transition, I think about who is governing these decisions, who rules, who decides, who sets the norms and principles that condition how people access scarce resources, energy and water, for example. And actually, here is an image from a workshop we had a year ago around servicing of toilets, sanitation again, but also to do with water and access and sustainability. And at this table is the Mayor of Cape Town sitting on the end here. There's one or two officials, but there's 3 residents, just residents, not local leaders. They have no position of power, residents from BM section. And I think there's one civil society activist here as well. There were 8 tables like this, and each table had to come up with their own solutions to sanitation servicing in Khayelitsha. And each person's solution counted as much, each table's solution counted as much. And in the end, we did a participatory evaluation process where everybody got 2 votes for which solution they felt was the best. The mayor got 2 votes, the resident from BM section got 2 votes. And we ended up then with a set of recommendations that went to the city and that the city had agreed to try and take on board. And what's important about this is that this shows that it is actually people that are the democratic infrastructure of how we think about sustainability, of how we think about access and servicing of resources like water and energy. So what do I mean by people's democratic infrastructure? Let's take a step back and first say, okay, infrastructure. What is infrastructure? Infrastructure is historically always thought of as material. It's the pipes, it's the roads, it's the physical networks we can see that transport water and energy, it's the grid. And that is all very true, and they are technical systems. But infrastructure is now, the infrastructural turn in urban geography has now moved on to say that people are actually infrastructure. And that how residents mobilize social relationships, their mobility patterns, their informal networks, sustaining city life, that's actually as much a social infrastructure as a technical infrastructure or material infrastructure. And if we're going to think about the importance of people as infrastructure or social infrastructure, we also have to think about the relationship between social infrastructure, material infrastructure, and the state. And so that takes us to the concept of infrastructural citizenship, the idea that how we use and access infrastructure, whether it's energy or water or toilets, it mediates state-society relationships. And how residents negotiate inclusion, make claims, and enact belonging through everyday interactions tells us a lot about the relationship between the state and between residents. And here I use the term citizen in a very broad sense, not in a legal sense at all, but to mean anybody who is living in and of a place, whether they have legal status or not. So infrastructure is not static or neutral. It's assembled, it's maintained, and it's contested through everyday practices. So now we think about contested. What does contested mean? And this is where I want to raise the idea of governance. And governance is a huge term. It can be understood analytically in multiple different directions and in multiple of different disciplines will have different ways of thinking about it. In my world, when I think about it from a politics perspective, I always think about governance as being who sets the rules, who tells people how they're going to behave, who follows the rules, why do they follow the rules, who holds power. So governance and power to me go hand in hand very closely. And the reality is that if we think about who sets rules and how rules work, particularly in informal areas, informal settlements, that actually governance is very rarely led by the state. It might have a strong state element, but the state alone is not what governs how people behave. And for an example, I didn't show you all of our energy pictures, but most of our energy pictures show how people access electricity through a neighbor, through an illegal connection, through some form of other power structure that has nothing to do with a direct relationship with the government. It may be they've got to work through a local committee and the committee has to give them permission. The traders in the one area that I was showing you an image of where the Shisanyama is, there's a committee system there. To even get a trading space, you have to engage with that committee system. That committee holds more power over who's going to be able to trade there. That it's an informal committee. It's not elected through any formal mechanism, even though there may be informal elections at some point. But that committee holds more power to decide who gets to trade there than the city ever will, even though it's a city-owned space and it's a city-managed space and it's city services. So the state is there. The state's providing the background. Sometimes it's providing a lot of the formal infrastructure, but it isn't always governing how spaces are actually used. So we've got to think about diverse actors and informal practices that shift forms of state involvement. And we've got to think also that there are multiple sites of authority. So anyone who's trying to think about how can I have a sustainable approach to energy access? How can I have a sustainable approach to water management? Has to then think beyond a state framework or legislative framework or policy framework and think about who's actually going to control who's getting access to resources and how they're being used, how much they cost. And that's not always going to be an official. So citizens, CBOs, local leaders, social movements, religious organizations, they all exercise public authority in everyday life. They all have forms of governance over people's everyday life. And this relates to the idea of politics of informality. So service access, infrastructure, property issues are often mediated through trust networks, personal relationships, patronage, who gets what, and extra institutional practices. So hybrid, and the term that I use when we're thinking about this informal governance, the governance with and beyond the state, because it's not outside of the state. It is with the state, but sometimes not always with the state leading. And this is a concept that I term hybrid governance or hybridized governance, because it's a negotiated space where formal and informal actors make the city work. And it's neither one nor the other. So now if we think about how does this relate? If we've got these infrastructures, social infrastructure, if we've got this hybrid governance taking place, how does this relate then to democracy? And why is democracy even important? And the reason I would say it's crucial for us to think about this is that when we think about hybridized governance, political informality, and the management and access of sustainable infrastructure, we have to take it from a lens of core democratic principles, not only because we live in a democracy, but because we have to think about redistributive justice, all of those social justice elements, whether it's redistributive, procedural justice, these are all closely aligned to democratic values and norms. So a democratic lens asks how everyday governing relates to participation, representation, accountability. I could also add in there freedom and equality. And we know that democracy is more than elections, much more than elections. It's a broader social project, grounded in inclusion, grounded in rights, and then also grounded in collective self-determination, which essentially means that people need to have some right to be able to decide how and where and when they're going to access resources and what that might look like for them, not only ever being enforced with a set of external rules and controls. Otherwise, you don't end up with a very democratic system or a very participatory system. So participatory and deliberative traditions show that residents can meaningfully inform policy and planning, and democratic innovations can also emerge from grassroots collective action, experimentation, and learning. And I think this is crucial for us to think about in relation to a just urban transition, because we need to keep experimenting. How do you experiment on the ground? How do you try new ways of thinking through sustainability in real-time learning? And therefore, if we think about people as democratic infrastructure, We're thinking about everyday practices and relationships that help residents voice their needs, mediate conflicts around governance, represent interests, solve problems, and engage the state. And we want to see that there's not only institutionalized participation, not just an IDP process or award committee where you're ticking a box and saying, yes, yes, we ticked the participation box. But the state was formally listening, but it wasn't really hearing. It was saying, we're asking you questions, but it was a one-way direction. And so you actually need less institutionalized participation and more actual meaningful participatory empowered engagement. And this is really relevant for planning because practices create a layer of engagement between citizens and the state that can support just and sustainable planning. So I'm coming to my conclusion now. What residents and local leaders do as democratic infrastructure is really important to think about. They are first responders when a system fails or system lags. So the state needs to know how to engage with the first responders, with the local leaders, with the residents in an area in which they're trying to engage and think about sustainable practices. They're interlocutors, they're informal representatives, they're mediators. They can also act as schools of democracy by trying to support more participatory fora and more participatory ways of engaging around planning. You're actually then building trust, cooperation, and modeling those kinds of values. And really key planning partners. And none of that is new. Co-production is a well-known, long-term idea. But it takes a different angle if you think about hybridized governance and you think about people as the democratic infrastructure and the values behind co-production. So there are a lot of implications for urban planning. Key amongst these is that technical policy solutions and formal participation is insufficient for just and sustainable planning. The best technical policy solution. I know that the Gates project, the Gates Foundation, for example, have designed the best disposable flush toilets for informal settlements. And do they work? No, because users are not robots. They are people, and they're going to use them in very different ways to which the technical policy, the technical solution envisaged it. So you need to understand why and how people are going to engage with infrastructure rather than design it for an anonymous audience. And if you understand and think about hybrid governance, you can then think about how situated knowledge exists. Who are intermediaries? How can we ensure accountability? How can we think about how we govern systems with the reality of how people actually live and the power relationships that actually control their access and usage to resources like water? So we need to think about a layer between citizens and the state of intermediaries sometimes too to help mediate that knowledge in that space. So the success of a just urban transition depends on inclusive and participatory governance, and it's important to understand and work with hybrid governance in order to access and think about structures. And we need to integrate diverse infrastructures, including viewing people as democratic infrastructure for a balanced form of sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Prof Anciano. That was a very thought-provoking interaction. And before anything, let me hand over to our second speaker, Ms. Wolpe. Over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can hear me, good. Thank you, Fiona. I think my following from you goes quite well, though a little bit of overlap, but not too much. It's quite a big topic that I've taken on, and I kind of end in a similar place to some of what you were saying, Fiona, but more kind of questions in a way. When I do these similar kinds of presentations, if it's in person, I often start by asking the audience to really think about your life, your upbringing. You know, did you grow up in a home with ceilings? Did you grow up in a formal structure? Did you grow up having access to electricity? And when we start to share that and talk about it, it kind of really brings you in touch with the reality of many people's lived experiences. Oh dear, now am not able. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I need to move a window. It's blocking my, there. So we are globally at a tipping point with climate change very much upon us. I think we're at the moment we're hearing about heat waves in Europe. We here in South Africa have experienced extreme weather conditions, flooding, etc. I think it's actually close to all of us. It's not some abstract concept. South Africa is classed as about the 13th highest carbon emitter in the world, which puts us pretty high up. And as Fiona was saying, just transition is very high on our agenda, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So let's just look at our context. Our economy is built around a, there, that's better. Sorry, I've got a block blocking my screen. We're built around a minerals energy complex, which was based historically on cheap coal and cheap electricity, which led to a very energy intensive industry sector with mining and smeltering and Sasol coal to liquid fuels. And coal generates over 82% of South Africa's electricity, which is a reduction. Not that long ago, we were over 90% of coal generated electricity. So there is an attempt to bring renewables into the space. And since 1922 has been controlled by the power utility Eskom. And I think everyone will be familiar with the financial crisis that Eskom has been experiencing, the planned closure of power stations, with the example of Komati, which has been very much in the new energy space news, and now the unbundling of Eskom into three entities: generation, transmission, and distribution. There are hiccups, but it is underway. Between Sasol and Eskom, they account for over 50% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. And then linked to what Fiona was saying, sorry, I'm skipping a bullet here. The outside of the big industries and mines, a substantial amount of the country's electricity is consumed in the built environment. So that does encompass residential, government, and commercial sectors. The MEC, so the Minerals Energy Complex, and the coal-related industries have contributed to significant social and economic inequalities, poverty, and environmental degradation. It's also important to note that most energy is consumed in the transport sector because of sprawling cities and poor public transport. So let's now go to just transition. It first emerged in the US, believe it or not, in the 1970s, which were focusing on the transition towards a lower emissions would have on employment. it's now much broader, and we talk about just transition and just energy transition, and the two are often conflated, but actually are quite different. So the just energy transition is very much focused on the energy sector, and the just transition, certainly the way I see it, has a broader environmental and ecological focus. So we'll bring in issues related to climate change and water as well. But both these terms are concerned with the impact of a transition on jobs, on maintaining inequalities or changing that, and giving voice to the poor. So the justice side of just, and I think Fiona spoke quite a bit about the 4 categories. I'm probably going to focus a bit more on participatory justice, but I'll come to that shortly. So if we think about Reconstruction and Development Program that came into effect in 1994, which had a focus on housing, water, and electricity, amongst others. I think that's where I am focusing more on energy here. But Fiona was talking about urbanization, and today, well, in 2025, over 69% of our population lived in urban areas and cities, and that figure is growing. And part of that is migration from rural areas into cities, where the perception and maybe the reality is of more chance of getting jobs. And from the RDP program, we've seen the building of more than 3 million low-cost housing for the poor. Most were built on the periphery of cities, and part of that is because government after democracy said to developers, build RDP housing, and they built on land that was cheaper, which was further away from the heart of cities. So we've seen spatial inequalities, and people are placed not, I guess, far from economic opportunities, which increase, particularly for the poor, the cost of travel to and from home to places of work where they have work. So our cities have been developing along sprawling and low density lines. And interestingly, initially when RDP houses were built, they were built without thermal insulation, particularly ceilings. And if you've lived or been into a shack without a ceiling in the summer or in the winter, you can feel the differences. I worked in Cape Town in the Joe Slovo development, where we did questionnaires afterwards, and there were solar water heaters installed, ceilings, and lighting, and the houses had overhangs to protect from the summer sun. And when asked what was the best change that was made to the housing, and most of the people talked about ceilings, particularly the women, who said that it made their homes neater. They didn't get so much dust. This is just an image of the spatial inequalities. I quite like this photograph. It's quite stark. So what do we mean by energy poverty? There is no one definition. Basically, energy is required for basic human needs, such as cooking, heating water, lighting, communications, and space heating. And energy poverty is deemed to be a lack of access to the energy resources required to meet these basic household needs. And it is primarily a lack of access to reliable and safe energy choices. That's because certain energy choices, I'll talk more about just now, are not so safe. But very, very importantly, it's not only about access to electricity, it's about affordability. And energy poverty is particularly prevalent in informal sectors where you see shacks that are built often on unproclaimed land and are often not suitable for basic service infrastructure. In fact, I think Cape Town was one of the first municipalities to develop the maypole system of electricity for informal settlements. And backyard dwellers, another instance of informality, and these are often shacks that are built onto formal houses, and they will share electricity from 1 meter. I just want to add to this, where you've got shared meters, which happens in other situations where a main house might be serving a number of other shacks. These households struggle to get the free basic electricity because they are using more than is deemed an amount for free basic electricity. So despite democracy, we still have high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And an estimated 47% of South African households live in energy poverty. And I think this figure is actually out of date. Unemployment, as you can see on the left of the screen, the official rate in the first quarter of this year, 32.7% of the population, with the expanded figure being closer to 45%. So that would include people who are no longer searching for work. And amongst the youth, that figure, that's youth under 24, almost 61% unemployed. So back in 1994, only 36% of our population had access to electricity, and that was predominantly white population and white housing. Today, the figure is high. It's at almost 90%. Although the electrification policy planned that we would have 100% by 2014, it hasn't happened, partly because of the growth in population, growth in housing, and costs. But yes, I wanted to show this image, and then I'll come to my but. It's quite out of date. The figures are out of date, but it's quite it really hits home. If you take on the left, on my screen, it's orange. 45% of mid to high income households are consuming 66% of energy. In the low income electrified houses, 46%, so almost the same number, are consuming half the amount of energy that a high income household is consuming. And in the low income unelectrified, they are consuming only 4% of energy. I mean, I think this is quite a stark image. Low-income households are spending up to 20% of their income on energy, compared to 2 to 3% spent by high-income households. So if you think about a very small amount of income that they might be having, that's a huge amount. When I mentioned that people, even if they are connected to grid electricity, can't afford to use that, or they are now engaging in fuel stacking, which is basically multiple fuel use. So people are using paraffin, coal, candles, wood, which would all depend on accessibility to these alternatives. Also, people can buy small quantities of paraffin, you know, in Coke bottles, which often lead to children have, many children end up ingesting, thinking it's Coke, and so the huge amount of hospitalization. Green Cape did a study around fuel stacking, and that people buy 4 candles because it's cheaper than buying maybe a whole pack, but in actual fact, in the long run, those costs are more expensive. So 4 will be more expensive than a pack, but it's what your disposable income is. We also see a lot of fires caused, maybe one shack will have a fire from a paraffin or other cause, and it's a domino effect, and a whole settlement can be erased. In areas like Mpumalanga, but not only, there are big problems with air quality and water and air pollution and evidence of illness. And in the Mpumalanga area, we've seen that emission standard, that Eskom and Sasol have negotiated non-compliance with some of the standards. Another major problem are respiratory diseases, and this can be from outside air pollution, but often is caused by cooking with coal in the home. Many children land up with not going to school because of illness, and hospital treatments for asthma and other illnesses. I want to turn to the gender question, and then I want to try and put all these 3 together. I do think that in the just transition discourse, gender is often left out. If we look a little bit at the statistics in urban areas, 40% of households are female-headed, and in rural areas that figure's close to 48%. Women-headed households, but women generally are very vulnerable and are more exposed to energy poverty. Generally, women are still learning less than men. In informal settlements, work that we've done with communities having poor or no external lighting, puts women at risk of gender-based violence, particularly if they have to go out to use a toilet or to a water outlet. We did a documentary a few years ago, and I remember one woman who points to down the street from the path where she lives, where the city had put in some lighting in an informal settlement, and she said, now we can see the gangsters if they're coming, and pointed down the road. Women are also more adversely affected by climate change. The women tend to be responsible for household tasks such as cooking food, collecting food, or providing food, and provision of energy. So this photograph is not unusual. Time used for procuring fuel wood, for instance, or collecting water, if not from your home, can take a long time and does have an impact on women's employment availability. An important point to make is that social grants that are meant for food are often used for energy, and we're seeing a lot of malnutrition, particularly amongst children. So, I mean, this bit feel like a whistle-stop tour, and maybe there will be questions, but where are the constraints and leverages for change, or where are the challenges? So I'm also now going to look a little bit at the institutional framework. So we, as everyone knows, we've got 3 spheres of government that are expected to operate independently, but in collaboration and in cooperation. Doesn't always happen. So, you know, policies should be working between the 3 spheres, but also what happens is that within each sphere there are departments and officials working under particular KPIs, their key performance areas, and so there's a lot of talk about siloed way of operating. And as I'm going to come to, but climate change, just transition, gender, energy poverty, they are cross-cutting, and so the siloed approach is not working. There is an intention in pretty much all policies since '94 to reduce poverty and inequality and increase employment. There are now a suite of policies addressing climate change, just transition, and the just energy transition. We've seen the introduction of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, where money was pledged at COP26 towards our just energy transition, and the project managing unit associated with the JED are administering money, but is it going to the communities? Not so convinced. The Presidential Climate Commission was developed, and they have now got a just transition framework. Again, the question for me is around policy intent and the disconnect between policy and implementation. And the requirement for public participation goes back to our constitution, and it is an expectation in all levels of government policy. However, it is often tick box and compliance. The idea of the justice side of the just transition was that participatory justice would be much more involving communities, getting the voice of those previously voiceless into the room, to be involved not only in identifying problems, but in the solutions. It's not happening in the way it was intended to happen. And in a way, historically, that's surprising for me, because if you look at the Freedom Charter that dates back to the struggle era, was developed at a time where citizens weren't allowed to engage publicly, and yet it was born out of public consultation. And today we are in a time where we are encouraging participatory justice, and somehow it's not happening. Communities there are engagements, but they are not feeling that they are being heard. Getting back to the gender issue, there's been much literature on gender mainstreaming, and a lot has been written about gender-based violence, maybe less so on unpaid care work. I think that we don't fully acknowledge or accept the level of unpaid care work that is taking place. Women are undertaking perhaps a lot of what should be covered by the state. I think we're not considering patriarchy and social norms and maybe our own gender biases. And I don't think that gender, as I said earlier, has really been brought into the just transition discourse. So we do see some policies that are specific to gender, but most are including a paragraph or an intent around gender, but the how is very much left out. There are various commissions like the Gender Commission for Equality and various forums and other systems like the Gender Machinery, as it's known, and other groups, but implementation is lagging. And that's the kind of theme that I feel I'm talking about in this presentation. The just transition discourse has overlooked gender and inequality, risking the replication of or worsening of systemic inequalities. I wanted to just talk very briefly about the constraints faced by municipalities when we're thinking about energy poverty. So in 2003, they brought out the free basic electricity policy, which allows a provision of 50 kilowatts of free electricity per household per month. And the free basic alternative energy policy came in later, which was to provide support to households not connected to the grid. That has been has not been rolled out as successfully as the free basic electricity because it's quite hard to administer. Municipalities receive transfers from national government for the provision of basic services, but it's not enough. And they are struggling to make the balance their books. They have to generate income from sale of electricity, property rates, etc. But with load shedding and as mid to high income users are putting up solar PV on their roofs, so the cross subsidization is challenged. There have been studies shown that the number of indigents, which is how they get their grants for free basic services based on the number of indigents, but the number that Treasury is supplying, let's say 100 indigents, they're actually allocating only 50. So there's a discrepancy because the money's not ring-fenced. And the way in which indigents are registered does lead to errors of exclusion and errors of inclusion of people that shouldn't receive. There is no legislation or mandate for addressing energy poverty, which I think is problematic. And the just transition is not a functional mandate of local government. And I've been involved in some work of trying to put a just transition into local government's IDP plan, which then could have budgetary implications. So I'm going to conclude with a range of questions. So as I've said, there's a disconnect between policy and implementation. And I think the question to ask is why? I think that part of that, well, we know some of the reasons are related to capacity, both resource and human capacity, to financial financial situation, to political will, and to working in silos. I think that what needs to be looked at are the big systemic issues, the structural changes and political economy. If we think about the current political economy of the country, the minerals energy complex, the coal, even if it is reducing and there is coal phase out, many of our industries are built on coal and electricity. And I'm not sure we've really addressed that question or space of bringing in a different and more equitable way of running our economy. I think that we have followed neoliberal lines, and that has had implications on the intention of good policies. So does the current economy lend itself to a just transition? I would say no, but I put that to the people sitting in the room now. I do think there have been some amazing innovations and changes that have happened. I'm not saying nothing has changed. I do feel that a lot does sit at the level of policy. So when you start to work with communities and listen to what they're saying, then don't feel that they're engaged with, they don't feel heard. They are hungry to be involved and to have opportunities. And I think we have to look at different ways of doing this. I do believe bottom down, up, from the bottom up. I should have put from the bottom up, not the bottom down. That's where leverage can lie. And I do think there's something about what you were saying earlier about grassroots action, new initiatives, maybe worker cooperatives. I've just recently come across a book, and I'm led to think about football is very much part of my family. And if you sit in a big football stadium and you watch the Mexican wave happen, somebody starts this and then it seamlessly follows across a stadium. People can build momentum, and I think that's a place for change. I think that is where innovation can lie, and people can be empowered to do that. I do think we really need to engage with communities and workers to hear their voices. I have been so humbled in sitting and working with communities and listening to what they have to say. And I think their voices need to be brought into the forefront. As I said earlier, I think gender and just transition are cross-cutting. They don't sit neatly into one department. So at government and governance level, there needs to be an attempt at how do we talk together? How do we see that my work in my department has relevance to what you're doing and to this just transition? I think the JET and JT need to prioritize gender and energy poverty. And I do think that the transition impacts on men and women differently. We need to ask who benefits from the transition opportunities. I leave you with a lot of questions, and I've tried to cover a lot, but I hope somewhere something resonates. Thank you. Oh, sorry, my last slide, sorry. I think what is required is a holistic, coordinated, cross-cutting approach. A low-carbon transition, energy poverty, gender equity, and social protection are all part of the same package. We need to bring communities into the discourse and into decision-making. We need to ask the hard questions, and we need to start doing things differently. And it's only then that we can hope to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius and ensure livelihoods of the poor are not compromised. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Wolpe. That was very insightful. So I am sure the audience has questions. So our Q&A session will be facilitated by Mr. Mbizeni. So Mr. Mbizeni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. T. So moving on to the Q&A round, just a few ground rules, everyone. So we're going to have a series of rounds for the Q&A. So in each round, I'm just going to take 5 hands. The people that I select, please do take note that you have 2 questions max to ask the speaker, but please be precise so that the speaker can respond. And then also, please do indicate who your question is directed to so that when you're done, I can easily cue the speaker to come in. And lastly, when you are done, please do indicate that you are done so that also I can cue the speaker to come in. So opening the first round, can I see a set of hands so that I can note you? The manner in which I note you, or rather the order, is the order in which you will speak, but I'll consistently remind you to come in. So first set of rounds for round 1. I see Dr. Lawrence will be our number 1. Are there any hands to note for round 1? Remember, I said I'm taking 5 hands. I see Justice Koza. Apologies if there is a title that I didn't mention. I am noting 2 hands, going once, going, oh, also Prof. I see Prof. Thank you, Prof. I have noted 3 hands for round 1, going once, twice. Perfect. I'm going to close this round just for now. So Dr. E, you may come in.
Thank you, Mr. Auctioneer. Thank you to both speakers. I found both presentations to be very interesting. For now, I just have one question for Prof. Fiona. You mentioned those informal committees and the power relationships and that they can control access to scarce resources. So the thing that came to my mind was gangsterism. I just wondered if you could maybe say something about that, what you think in terms of how we can exclude gangsterism or eradicate gangsterism at that kind of level of access to resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. E. Prof. Fiona. The speaker will respond and then I'll open for the next speaker. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thanks very much. That is such an excellent question. And it is something that we've been grappling with in our research. So I'm going to just refer mostly to the Khayelitsha work we've done because that is what I know best, but also that is where we've seen the most significant impact of what we are calling. So obviously, when you think of the term gangsterism, I'm going to actually just be quite specific here and talk more about extortion networks and protection networks. I think organized crime at a local level is prevalent in many contexts, but I'm not referring here to specifically like organized gangs in the Cape Flats, for example, because we've seen less of any of that kind of impact in the areas we've worked. But what we have very much seen, and this is absolutely a step change. So I've been working in Khayelitsha for 8 years now. And before that was working in an area called Imazama-Yetu. And there's a significant change in the power in which protection networks, I'll call them that, or extortion organizations have over resources, access to resources, and the basic operation of small businesses. And what this means is that if you want to run a small business, if you're successful in any way, you're most likely going to be asked to pay some kind of payments to a protection network, someone who's saying, we'll protect you if you give us so much per month. Obviously, if you don't give them the money, they will do the opposite of protect you. And so it's a very problematic context. We are wanting to, and I have a colleague who's been looking at doing research in this to understand what this means I mean, from our perspective, it's from understanding how local neighborhood settlements are governed, who holds power, and how it's changing people's behavior. But I think that has a spill-on effect in multiple different ways. And even if we just think about it from a resource perspective, to give you a quick example, sorry, I'll be brief, this is a long answer. A quick example, I mean, what we found in a lot of the eateries in Makaza, for example, that none of them had fridges. And we were like, why don't you have fridges? And actually it turned out that because they all have cold meat, and they were storing them in friends' freezers and then bringing them in, or then having to buy fresh every day. And it turns out that they were being broken into on a regular basis in the past, and their fridges were being stolen, or their freezers were being stolen, because they hadn't been paying a protection fee. And they were in a rock and a hard place. Do we do that? Do we not do that? But it was literally affecting the ways in which they run their business, their relationship with energy, whether or not they needed electricity or didn't need, or whether they, So yeah, I'm just giving you a small anecdote, but to say I think this is a really important issue, and I think it's a growing concern across most informal settlements, but most definitely significantly in Cape Town.
Thank you very much, Prof Fiona. I see Dr. E is happy with the response. Our second question is from Justice Khoza. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank both speakers. The presentation was very insightful. My question is for Prof Anciano, which I would like to link to a recent court case. I know that you are not a practitioner of law. However, I find that this is very relevant considering your niche in just urban transition. So in the case of summer season trading, 63 versus 62 of Tshwane in the Supreme Court of Appeal rejected an expropriation claim by the municipality. So in that specific case, in terms of just urban transition, because there were individuals who were occupying the space there, and because of administrative issues, after they've been granted the eviction by the High Court, the local authorities, therefore, instead of actually enforcing that eviction order and actually putting the illegal occupiers in an alternative environment as per the Act and the Constitution provides. In that case, what I find alarming is that there was no cooperation between, the municipality and the owner, although, that is not a requirement. But what happens in instances where there's no alternative land for the individuals and the municipality has already been overburdened by these administrative tasks? Would did not suffice for the owners, especially given that there's this prevalence that, or the idea that these dwellers are not safe simply because there is this ownership dynamic that they might not be aware about, and it actually translate into the fears of them living in the spaces that they occupy, because as you've mentioned, part of the reasons is gangsterism, and if they own specific business, they have to pay some sort of, informal tax showing that the legitimate owner or, those who pose as being in power. So wouldn't it be a proper justifiable transition to have this cooperation between the three parties, say the impugned dwellers, the owner, and the municipalities in such instances? I would like your take on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Menir Koza. Prof, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Taking furious notes about the case. Sounds very interesting. I think land occupations are complicated, right? And I think you can look at them in multiple ways. But what I'm going to just reflect on is where this is as much it can be as much a political question, and by that I mean a question of who's holding power in that environment, as much as it is a legal question, right? So the law is only going to be effectively implemented if the state has the capacity to do so. And so there are many cases of land occupations where the residents still live there. They didn't move off the land and they still occupy that. And generally, what our research has shown when we've looked at, and I've had students who've done their theses on land occupation and understanding from day one, like they followed the occupation from the day that the people moved onto the land. Actually, one of my master's students happened to be walking across a field in Langa when people were occupying a land, and he decided, oh, I'll just study this for the next 2 years. And he did. It was fascinating. But the key thing there was the committees and the organization. So power is, there are multiple sources of power, but organization is the core main source of power. And if the occupiers are not organized in that they are not able to leverage their own political power to be able to counter the kind of human right to land, human right to security, human right to, the right to use the legal precedent, that they can muster to be able to say we have a right to be here, but B, we have extraordinary power, and I'm not going to say violence per se, but we have other sources of power we can use, including what we would call condign power in politics, or like the threat of force. You're not going to ever get to negotiations because they're not going to have a voice. So that's not an answer. I do not know how one resolves this. I'm just saying that this is what we've seen in other contexts and other research, where why do some communities end up on land and others don't? Why does a municipality sometimes negotiate and other times doesn't? Why do, and that has been one of the things we've seen, that it's where there's organized action that shows both what I call a moderate and a radical flank, the radical flank of condign physical threat, and the moderate flank of saying, actually, we have a constitutional human right to be heard and looked after.
Thank you very much, Prof Fiona. The third question is coming from Prof Oliver. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks very much. I want to begin by really appreciating Prof Fiona and Ms. Peta for wonderful presentations that they have delivered, which moved away from strictly legal compliance that we focus on in the past, to really shine the light on the lived socio-spatial realities of people in the communities that they have been working with. The first question which I have also relates to the point which Lawrence raised, and the work that you've been doing and the argument that you are making about the existence of hybrid forms of governance relate very closely to the findings that one of our colleagues, Dr. Krisdan, made in his thesis, that there's increasingly a drive towards collaborative governance and co-production, as you alluded to. And his research shows that there have even been instances where communities and community organizations even try to take away legal powers that are vested in municipalities, to be able to do things on their own. And we've had instances where the courts were able to stop them from doing that. And there were a few instances where municipalities had completely given up on their responsibilities, and the courts were able to encourage them to do so. So you have a situation where I think the rule of law and the principle of legality become implicated. And you've indicated that in some of the contexts where you operate, you find people who actually control how others are able to access electricity illegally. And these are really issues of law and order, issues of the rule of law, which we know is a big problem in the South African context, given especially recent developments that we've seen with organizations like March and March. So I don't know if you've had time to reflect on that in the context of your research. And then obviously the second question, which I think is directed to both of you, is whether you've been able to come across concrete instances where the law acts as an enabler or an inhibitor to a just urban transition in the context of your work.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm going to allow Prof Fiona to answer first and then Ms. Peta to follow. Prof, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Such good questions from this panel. Thank you. You know, in terms of the first question around the tension between the rule of law and so actually this takes me back a couple of decades to, I did my PhD looking at the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, which at the time was a sort of community organization that were demanding free basic electricity and illegally reconnecting residents in Soweto to the electricity grid. And it was very interesting because the question I asked in my research was, well, one of the questions was, what is the balance between democratic norms, between the norm of the rule of law and between the norm of equality, access, and how do you balance the right to access to services and redistributive justice with the need to have and uphold a rule of law? So and ultimately it was a study of a social movement. But I think the reason I'm raising that is that this is not new. I mean, this has been an ongoing question forever in South African politics, really. And obviously, no need to say to this audience that that's why laws can change, right? I mean, the policy should be flexible. Laws should be flexible to change as society changes within reason, obviously. But yeah, so I mean, again, you guys have asked really tricky questions. I don't have any clear answers, but I think that there is a really important, I think whenever you're looking at any case, to ask about those balance. Where and how do you think through the balance of these different norms, of these different approaches, and how far is breaking the rule of law going too far? And in the case when I was looking at the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, they really weren't going too far. They were never causing any individual harm. There was never any physical threat. It was material infrastructure that was, being cut and reassembled. So, in my analysis there, I think it seemed quite clear that they were supporting so many other strong democratic values that it outweighed the one where there was some damage to infrastructure, but ultimately allowing people to have electricity connection. And actually, I don't know if many of you know that, but their work led to court cases, constitutional court cases that led in many ways to the free basic electricity ruling. So is law an enabler or an inhibitor to the just urban transition? Probably both, but I'm going to just speak to what I've seen in our more recent research in both cases and both sites have been working in. And I'm not sure, the way I would give a sort of short answer to this is that you can see that legal framework is important. It sets the playing field, right? It creates an external framework in which it's the stage in which actors have to perform. It exists, it's there, and let me try and think of a metaphor. It's like saying they're traffic lights, right? They're robots. People know they've got to stop at the lights. They know the lights are there and they know what the rules of the road are. It doesn't mean they always stop. And even when somebody wants to stop at the traffic light, they can't because someone is forcing them to move on, even if they chose to follow the law. So what we see in a lot of our research is that the extent to which you have any autonomy to actually follow the laws, often outside of your own hands. You may not want to illegally reconnect to electricity. You probably don't. It's not safe. It's literally physically dangerous to you, and you could be fined. But without that, you have no business, you have no access, or you're reliant on other networks that are unsustainable to you, that you can't afford, or that threaten you, or that you don't have control over. So I think increasingly the role that legal frameworks play is, particularly in the areas in which we work, is becoming more and more tenuous, and that the actual what I would call the sovereignty of the state, the ability of the state to be the sovereign power that decides how or ensures how people should act, is really shifting away quite rapidly in South Africa from being centered in the state, or certainly in the local municipality.
Thank you very much, Prof. Handing over to Ms. Peta to provide a response to Prof. Oliver's question as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting and a hard question. I mean, I think I would put a question back, is how did we get there and how do we change it? Because obviously disregarding the rule of law and causing harm or damage is not okay. But what is the answer? And yeah, taking, as Fiona did, the illegal electricity connections. I've talked with city officials who are actually living with trauma because of deaths caused by the illegal connections. But if you talk to people, they want and need electricity, and they have a right to electricity. So where do you start? Do you deal with the action? Yeah, but you need to find a solution. And unfortunately, that's not an overnight response, but we sit with massive problems around housing, about gender-based violence, of not living with access to electricity or water or toilets. And 30 years on, it should not be like that. So how do we change what is happening, what is right now, in order to stop violent reactions to this situation? I think that's the more important question, to get to the systemic answer.
Thank you very much, Ms. Peta. Chair of the session, I'm noting that we have overlapped to the next segment of the program. Are you permitting me to take another round of questions?
Yes, Mr. Mbizeni, I think if there are any last remaining questions, we can take them so that we can quickly be on schedule.
All right, thank you very much, Chair of the session. I'm opening another round of questions. I see Dr. A's hand is up. I'm noting it. Is there any other hand as well? I'm urging people to utilize this opportunity. I see Khoza yet again. I'm noting you as the second. Is there another hand? Going once, going twice. Proceeding to the questions. Dr. E, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sandile. My question is to Ms. Peta, in the spirit of the theme of today's session, where we're not looking at the law as such. You mentioned at the end of your presentation that we need to start doing things differently. And I think your previous answer basically spoke about the same thing, how we will get to facilitate this change. And all of this for me speaks to behavioral change, so social and behavioral change. We have to do things differently. And you also mentioned that we have policies, but there's a disconnect between policies and the actual implementation. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. Maybe policies and even legislation isn't the answer. Have you thought about what other tools we can use to facilitate and induce this behavioral change? If you don't mind, just sharing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. E. Ms. Peta, you may come in with the response.
Yeah, thank you for putting me on the spotlight. I have had some thoughts, and I was trying to bring those in, perhaps not so well in the last bit of my presentation. I think that I've got the Einstein quote in my head. If you keep the definition, I think it's something like this: definition of stupidity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different response or result. And we're working tirelessly in all of us in the work we're doing, and then we're not seeing a significant enough change. And then what happens is people do become violent in order to get noticed. So your question is, what can we be doing differently? The one thought I have had is that perhaps some of the people who are in decision-making positions could be meeting. So across the sectors, you could get academics, government, politicians, business, community, civil society, labor, come into the room and we run a process of looking at one of the many topics that we've been looking at today. We could take social change, we could take gender mainstreaming, and really engage together, not develop a policy or a complicated framework, but to really start to think about it and work together to think differently. Each of us, I suppose, individually can change our behaviors, but these issues are much bigger than us individually. I think if we could start somewhere, I do. Maybe it's partly my age, my background. I'm a child of struggle activists, but I look back to what led to 1994, and the people were doing things with integrity and working to a greater cause. There wasn't the level of greed or corruption. I'm not saying there wasn't any at all, but can we learn from that period in any way about how to do things a little bit differently? I also think we overcomplicate at times, but yeah, I haven't really answered your question because I don't have the magic answer. But maybe starting with a group of people to really think and explore, and maybe that can snowball. I don't know, maybe you have some ideas. I'd love to hear if you do.
No, Ms. Peta, thank you. I apologize for putting you on the spot. I don't have any ideas either, but yeah, no, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
No, but it's good to be put on the spot. I think that's what we need. We need to think outside of the box. And
exactly.
I think that's a place for young people with their energy.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Peta and Dr. E. Khoza, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mbizeni, it's Advocate Justice Cause. My question is to Ms. Peta, and I would like to pose this question first into asking whether this is an economic hurdle or a legal hurdle when it comes to energy, electricity, water, and the question of infrastructure as it includes individuals. Since we're standing at about 82%, as you mentioned, of using coal as our source of generating power, and this is causing, it's a major contributor for emissions. Do you think it's an economic or a legal hurdle into tapping into hydroelectricity or wind as a form of electricity, and the alternative electricity generating mechanisms that we have, as opposed to solely relying on that aspect? Do you, in your view, think this is an economic hurdle, that it is not feasible because the state does not have, or the relative department does not have the requisite capacity or the requisite budget for it? Or is it just simply a legal question that it's something that cannot be implemented because of some ethical issues, including but not limited to the fact that there is this I'll call it inzinyoka situations where there's just individuals who are just tasked to just make sure that we don't get this power. I hope you understand my question. Thank you very much, Ms. Peter.
Thank you.
very much.
Thanks
You
for
may
the.
proceed.
Sorry, shall I answer?
Yes, you may, ma'am. Please proceed.
Thanks for the question. It's quite a complicated question and answer. So I don't think it's either economic or legal, and I think that there is an intention that we should be transitioning. So we've got the big renewable energy independent power producers program that has brought renewable energy into the space. The regulations is not quite legal, but the regulations have changed to enable municipalities and individuals to develop small-scale solar PV, and the regulations are changing. The electricity acts have been updated. The problem, as I see it, is that it's interconnected, which is why I said at the very end that it needs a kind of holistic response. The intention to bring more renewable energy into the mix to enable us to transition to a lower carbon economy is there. But then the most recent electricity plan for the country maintains coal and gas, so that there's some there is some conflict almost. And I believe that our political economy is so tied into the kind of coal and energy intensive industries that once you start dismantling that has a huge impact on the people who are capitalists, for want of a better term, who retain quite a lot of political power. And we've seen that. I've just recently got a book about billionaires and the kind of political power that people with money wield. So legally, I'm not a legal expert. I think there are changes to that are happening that allow a transition, but it's stuck. It feels to me to be stuck, and many people that I've worked with in the sector are feeling similarly, and that's why I do think we need to find a way of how do we challenge, how do we change, how do we make this happen faster, because the world is not looking good for future generations. So we must be responsible now. I know we're running out of time and I could go on, but maybe I should stop there. I hope I've a little bit answered your question.
Thank you very much. You have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Peta. Handing over to Ms. Mpahlela. Thank you everyone for participating in the Q&A. Apologies if I got your titles wrong. It wasn't intentional. Over to you, Ms. Mpahlela.
Thank you, Mr. Mbizeni. We're going to move to the next section where we will have final inputs from both our speakers, just to tell us about anything that you found interesting, final thoughts, and the whole experience as well, and anything that you might have missed in your presentation. So, Prof Fiona and Ms. Wolpe, in that order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say from my side, thank you for inviting me to have this very interesting conversation. And I think the main thing I was just reflecting on, thinking, listening to everyone and the questions as well, is that we probably are not talking enough across our different intellectual silos. I don't want to say disciplinary because not everyone is an academic, but we all work in different, we tend to spend a lot of time talking to people who are either have similar ideas or working in a similar space. And actually what I've loved about today is to think more about, well, what, how do we think about the legal aspect to this? And then also, from Peter's, Ms. Wolpe's presentation, to go back to the basics as well and get a much clearer sense of what's actually happening. So I really enjoyed that cross kind of, that cross different disciplines and silos and intellectual thinking debate. So thank you very much for orchestrating this.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a great challenge also just to think through the topic in a slightly different way. I really enjoyed listening to you, Prof Fiona, and I've really enjoyed the questions and getting questions from a different perspective, I think, as you saying, Fiona. So my takeaway is very much this sense of we need to work more collaboratively and across our disciplines and across our silos, I guess, our workplaces. But yes, thank you for the opportunity, and it's been really interesting.
Thank you very much, our speakers and also our audience. This was a very insightful and invaluable knowledge that we have received today. So to wrap up and to conclude the event, I will hand over to Ms. Sikwakwa. Ms. Sikwakwa, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Mpahlela. Good afternoon, everyone. As we bring this conversation to a close, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to our speakers, Prof Fiona and Ms. Wolpe, for sharing their valuable insight and challenging us to think more deeply about the kind of urban futures we are striving to build. And I strongly believe that today's discussion has reminded us that Reimagining a just urban future requires not only democratic and inclusive governance. However, it also includes meaningful action to address issues such as energy poverty, gender inequality, and the pursuit of just transition. A special word of appreciation goes to our organizing team, led by Ms. Tato Mphahlele, whose hard work behind scenes made this event possible. And thank you also to Mr. Mbizeni for facilitating the Q&A session and helping to enrich our discussion through a thoughtful engagement. And also to our audience, thank you for your active participation, insightful questions, and continued commitment to this important conversation. Your engagement is what makes these dialogues meaningful and also impactful. And please stay connected with the CLES through our various social media platforms for information on our upcoming events, where we will continue to engage with issues at the intersection of cities, law, and also environmental sustainability. This session will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So please do visit the channel, subscribe, and also share it within your network so that this important conversation can reach even a wider audience. Thank you once again for joining us today. Until then, take care, stay engaged, and see you once again soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, and bye, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
and
you.
goodbye.
Goodbye.